been thinking of this idea for a little while now. I want to rank presidents on whether or not Andrew Jackson would approve of them. Have you seen before? I already made a poll about whether or not Jackson would approve of Trump, and I wanted to do. I've had this idea for a little while now. Let's just get started. George Washington. Now, I think it's well known that while Jackson was serving as a representative, that he wasn't too much of a fan of Washington. Kind of like similar to the way Jefferson was, and he didn't approve of the Jay Treaty or the National Bank. So early on, he did not approve that much of George Washington, but after he left, and I think after he was president, he wrote about how he respected George Washington as like a military leader, and I think he called him, quote, the great benefactor of my country. So I think at the end, I think most likely would approve of George Washington, but since he was more of a Jefferson guy, I don't know. And Washington's pretty pro-British and instated the National Bank, so. But fellow war heroes, and I think he, at the end of the day, he respected Washington, so most likely. John Adams, I don't think he would have. I don't know if he'd approve. I don't think he would approve of the Alien Sedition Acts, and Adams proposing strong relations with the British over the French, since Jackson was a well known hater of the British, for good reason, knowing what the British did to him and his family. So, most likely, I don't think he'd approve of Adams. Jefferson, I think we put him in the first, absolutely. He was more of a Jefferson guy in the early days of the country. And also like Jackson, Jefferson didn't approve of the National Bank and favored the French over the British. So I think you like Jefferson. I mean, I don't know who didn't back in the day. Madison. This is an interesting one. A lot of people these days in this little community don't like Madison because of the War of 1812. I think you would like Madison because of the War of 1812. It's what gave him a job as a general. So yeah, and I don't know if I learned recently that Jackson often, as president, sought advice from James Madison in like his dealings with the National Bank and other economic issues. So I think, yeah, he'd approve of Madison. Oh, he was very. I thought, yeah, I think he'd be a very big supporter of war with the British for sure. So I think he'd approve of James Madison. Monroe, same. It during the first Seminole War, that was during Monroe's presidency, invaded Florida from the Spanish. It caused a lot of problems, a lot of debates in Monroe's cabinet, and I think to help quell some of that, he visited Jackson at the Hermitage, and they discussed things, and Monroe made him the governor of the Florida Territory. So yeah, and Jackson supported Monroe in the 1820 election, supported him for president. Well, I mean, everyone did, but yeah, I think John Quincy Adams, I think we all know. Hell no. I don't need to explain myself. I mean, a very bitter elections, 1824, 1828, hated Quincy Adams' guts, and Quincy Adams also hated Jackson's guts. Corrupt bargain thing, all the mean stuff the Quincy campaign said about his wife and him in general. It was very bitter elections. I think the two hated each other's guts. Andrew Jackson, I don't know what you think about Andrew Jackson. Sure, they both grew up poor, both hated the National Bank, both hated the British, but I don't know if we can know for sure what Andrew Jackson would have thought about Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren, I would want to put most likely since he let him down in 1840, but I think since he's his VP after all, so I don't need to explain that. I think William Henry Harrison we put in another hell no. Uh, William Henry Harrison built off undoing a lot of what Jackson did, like reinstating the National Bank. So I think on that alone, I mean, I guess they're fellow war heroes, fellow generals, but I don't think that'd be enough. I don't think he would have approved. I don't think he did approve at all. John Tyler, I think, despite the fact they agreed on the national bank and other economic issue, I think John Tyler was another nullifier. He was kicked out of the Democrat Party for supporting Calhoun. So no, I don't think he's too similar to John C. Calhoun. So no, James K. Polk, another easy, absolutely fellow Jacksonian, Jackson's protege, young Hickory to the old Hickory. So pretty easy. Zachary Taylor is interesting. Another Whig, but he's only a Whig because the Whigs just got to him first because he was not a very political man, not very experienced politician, which I think Jackson would have supported. And you fellow war heroes. So maybe, well, maybe most likely, maybe he's a Whig, but he wasn't that political fellow. And I think maybe. No, wait. No, I don't know. No. I think, no, we'll just put him in maybe. Fillmore, another Whig, so most likely wouldn't. Well, maybe he would have approved of the Fugitive Slave Act. I don't know, but he was a Whig, so I don't think so. This is a sad one, but I most likely would have approved of Pierce, fellow Democrats, and all. I think Pierce is labeled as frequently as a Jacksonian, popular sovereignty, quite populist, I might add, and reduced the national debt, second most of any president, to Andrew Jackson. So I hate to admit it, but most likely. Well, I mean, character was a very important issue for Jackson, and Pierce didn't really have all that good of a character, but probably. Buchanan's another one, probably most likely. Fellow Democrats probably aligned on most issues, but the character issue, and the character was very important to Andrew Jackson. And then his handling of the secession crisis, very weak man. I don't think Jackson would have approved of that. Also, approved of like character, not like presidency. But yeah, they should have marked that before. Lincoln, this is another interesting one. Lincoln admitted in the early days of his political career he was more of a Henry Clay guy, more of a Whig. But, both grew up poor, born in a log cabins, founders of the two political parties we're stuck with today. Very similar stories with those two. And I think with Lincoln's handling of the Civil War, I think Jackson would approve of Lincoln. Probably more so than Washington. But again, you never know, since he was a former Whig and probably agreed more with Henry Clay than Jackson. But with his handling of the Civil War, and they're very similar backgrounds and Lincoln's strong character, I think most likely. This is another one I hate to admit, but fellow Tennesseans, fellow Andrews, Jasons, Andrew Jackson was very racist. It's not like another Buchanan. He didn't flunk secession. He just flunked Reconstruction, and maybe, I don't know, character was a very important issue for Jackson. Johnson didn't have that much of a good character. But I'm thinking either maybe or most likely, although I hate to admit it. I'll just put it maybe. Another interesting one. Grant, similar backgrounds again. Fellow war heroes. I could see them too sharing a glass of whiskey. So, most likely. And Grant's presidency, like Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis, sent the military in to solve all the problems. So I think most likely he would have approved of Grant. I don't know for sure. Hayes, maybe. Hayes was a Whig early on, so he didn't approve of Jackson very much, and wanted to pass civil service reform to fight the spoil system. So Hayes didn't like Jackson, but so that probably means I don't think these two would get along very good. But again, Hayes was a good man, and Jackson could respect a good character. But I think with their disagreements on things, I don't think these two would get along very well. I think we'll put him in. Garfield's another interesting one. Both, again, another similar situation with many who grew up poor and stuff, and Garfield's a good man. Similar thing to Jackson being anti-corruption, so maybe. I think I put Arthur the same way. I think maybe Jackson liked Arthur better for the Chinese Exclusion Act, quite similar to the Indian Removal Act, if you think about it. But since they both built as anti-corruption, grew up poor, succeeded through hard work, maybe. But again, wanted to fight the spoil system which Jackson created. I don't know if Arthur got in a fight with Polk voters, so I don't think he'd like Jackson. But maybe Jackson would have liked Arthur. I think Jackson would absolutely approve of Cleveland. Similar background, similar policies, anti-corruption. Cleveland's economic beliefs and policies similar to Jackson's. Sound money policy, very similar to Jackson's. So and also fellow Democrats. So I think he'd approve of Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison. Jackson used tariffs, but only to pay down the debt. And I don't know if he opposed the tariff of abominations. I don't think he'd like the McKinley tariff. So I most likely wouldn't be too much approve of Benjamin Harrison. McKinley, both are generals and war heroes. So maybe. Again, Jackson didn't like tariffs, but he used them. So, Okay, Theodore Roosevelt. Here's where things get exciting. Both are war heroes. Both looking out for the common man above the rich and the powerful. Strong personalities, very strong personalities. So, it's either they compete with each other or they would get along. So, two strong personalities. Who knows if they'd get along, but very similar, those two. The square deal, very populist. So I think, Jackson didn't support government intervention in the economy, so I don't know if he'd approve trust busting, but sticking it to the rich. So most likely. Taft, maybe. I don't know. Okay, let's get Wilson. I don't think both were Democrats, sure, but I don't. Jackson, despite extensively using the executive branch, was more small government, favor of limited government and limited involvement in the economy, laissez-faire, if you will. And Wilson was probably the entrenched, elitist that Jackson despised so much. So I don't think he'd like Wilson at all. The racism he'd probably tolerate, but Wilson was kind of a smug elitist, so I don't think Jackson would like him very much. And I don't know if he'd like all of his big government policies. Well, there's some debate if Jackson was small government. I think he was, although he used the executive branch frequently. Well, because he had a lot of big jobs to do, so. Warren Harding, again, character is very important for Jackson, and Harding was a bit scummy, So I think we'll just put him in hell no. I think we'll order it this way, actually. Yeah. Calvin Coolidge, I think most likely he would have. Good. Coolidge was a good guy. Very similar economic beliefs of limited government intervention in the economy, laissez-faire economics, both of them. Fiscal conservatives, reduce the debt, balance budgets. I think he would have approved of his policies, and he was a good enough man, so I think we'll put him in absolutely. Herbert Hoover was a good man, which I think Jackson would respect, but his presidency wasn't really looking out for the people as much, and frequent usage of tariffs, which Jackson used but didn't like. so most likely wouldn't approve of him. But I think we'll put him higher up since he was a good man, kept millions of people fed. So I think we'll put him there. FDR. This is another interesting one. Again, stated this multiple times. He didn't approve of government intervention in the economy, which FDR's whole economic system right there, which is his whole thing. So I don't know if he'd like that. I don't know if he'd be a big fan of the New Deal. If he didn't like Henry Clay's American system, I don't know if he'd be a big fan of the New Deal. But Japanese internment, very similar to Indian removal. And he was another strong executive executing the will of the people. FDR was a huge fan of Jackson, so he'd be super stoked to meet him. So, maybe. I think we'll put him highest, maybe. There's also the character issue. I don't know. FDR is another kind of rich elitist himself, and cheated on his wife a bit, which Jackson definitely would not have approved of. But his presidency, he maybe would approve. I don't know if he'd approve of his character, but his presidency, maybe, probably. So we'll just put him there. Harry Truman was another big fan of Andrew Jackson. Similar with those two, strong personalities. Grew up poor in the backwoods of their respective states. So I think he'd most likely approve of Harry Truman. There's this story I've heard while Truman was remodeling the White House. He was I think he was at night, and he heard the ghosts of Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt stomping around and cursing at each other. I don't believe in ghosts. I think that's BS, but I think that's a funny story of some of my favorite presidents, Andrew Jackson, Harry Truman, and Roosevelt Reagan's favorite, well, former favorite, before Reagan showed up. It's a fun story. Pretty accurate, but I don't believe in ghosts one bit, so I think it's a bunch of BS. Don't know why I went on that tangent there. I probably should have said that while talking about Roosevelt, but I think I think we'll put him in absolutely. Why not? Eisenhower, I think, is another most likely. War heroes. He used the military to force integration, like how Jackson threatened to force the military to get South Carolina back into line. So I think, yeah. JFK also cheated on his wife. Jackson would not approve of that. But again, another war hero. Hard worker, fellow Democrat. So, maybe. LBJ, no. Like I said, character, honor, being a gentleman, very important to Jackson. Didn't like government intervention, so no, I don't think he'd like LBJ or Richard Nixon. If Andrew Jackson hated paper money, I think he'd really hate Nixon getting us off the gold standard for sure. And again, he's a bad character. Probably from Jackson's perspective, he would have been at least. Gerald Ford is another maybe. Maybe. I don't know where, but I guess with him here. Hey, he's a nice guy. Jackson would like that. There's nothing too wrong with Ford. I don't know if Jackson would hate him too much, so maybe. I think we'll put him most likely. Carter, like I said, moral character, very important to Jackson. Fellow Southern Democrats. I don't think he'd be too big fan of his presidency. But most likely, I think we'll put him there. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a huge fan of Andrew Jackson. They never tell you that, but he was. Held a portrait of him in the White House, so Ronald Reagan liked Andrew Jackson. And I think Jackson would approve of Reagan. So, most likely. I don't know if Andrew Jackson would approve of Reagan's handling of the debt, though. But similar, like, policies of fiscal conservatism, though. So, I think so. I don't think he'd approve of H.W. Bush. Again, another entrenched, elitist, very insider director of the FBI, very experienced a very experienced politician. I don't think Jackson liked those guys very much, so I know most likely wouldn't. Same with Bill Clinton. Again, Jackson was a very loyal man to his wife and respected fellows who were very loyal to his wife. I'll put him in maybe. Again, another physical conservatives, balanced budget. It's pretty good at eliminating deficits. So maybe, but again, there's the character issue and how he treated his wife, which I don't think Jackson would have approved of. And I think we'll put W. Bush in a maybe. I don't know if I don't think he'd approve of his presidency very much. I don't know if he'd understand his presidency because of the modern world. I don't know if he would have any idea what the heck's going on in his presidency. But I think again, hated government intervention. I don't think he'd approve of the Patriot Act. But George W. Bush, he's a nice enough guy, which Jackson would respect. So yeah, Obama, Jackson was very racist, so probably yeah. Trump, okay, this is the one I did the poll about. Let me just check the progress on it with my phone real quick. Oh wow, it's getting close. 15 votes, 47. 47 say yes, and then no, 53%. So mostly. Hmm. So it looks like so far people are saying he won it, but it's very close though. Hmm. This is an interesting one. I think they have very similar policies, very similar backings and messages of populist outsiders going to sweep up the government of corrupt elite insiders. Very similar messages, similar policies, and whatnot. But Jackson only married one woman, remained loyal to her, so I don't think he'd like Trump's character very much. And he was very distrustful of the rich. There's the quote. To quote the man, it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their own selfish purposes. He didn't like the rich. He didn't like elitists, so I don't know if he approved too much of Trump, but similar policies. I think at the end of the day he'd approve of his presidency, but most likely wouldn't approve of the man himself. So just maybe. Biden, no. Well, I think we'll put Trump maybe, and Biden most likely wouldn't. Yeah, here, let me order these better real quick. He'd probably approve of Polk the most of any president, since his protege, after all. Probably there too. Yep, 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 yep. Seems good to me. Seems good to me. All right, seems good to me.